does, or what should, the average club player want from an opening variation, and especially with black? In my view, they should want something easy to play, easy to understand, easy to learn, and which will furnish good results. Now, obviously this is a kind of magic formula. You know, you don't happen upon these opening variations every single day. But occasionally it does no harm to make your life easy. And so my recommendation on this part of the DVD will be a variation of the French called the Fort Knox defence, which is designed to make black's life easy as possible. Let's just go through the opening moves now, with black playing e6, the French, and now white can play either knight c3 or knight d2. Please note that I don't intend to go through other variations of the French apart from the main line involving an early development of white's queen's knight, and now black takes on e4 and white recaptures with the knight. The first impression is one of a labour-saving device if black's idea is going to work. He develops his bishop to d7 and then he brings it to c6, immediately attacking the knight on e4. By playing this way, you don't exactly sidestep two of the main lines, knight c3 and knight d2, but what you do is you compress the amount of knowledge you need to learn into one variation. And white will play bishop d3 as he normally does, and black plays knight d7. And this is the introductory position of the Fort Knox defence. Now, not many people know this, but the Fort Knox defence got its name actually from me. I was in Seville in 1987 playing in an open tournament alongside the Kasparov-Karpov World Championship match, and I needed something with black to play against really strong players. I was touring with a great friend of mine, international master Bruno Carlier from Holland, and we were discussing this idea in the French, you know, the early development of the knight to d7, and we thought, well, what should we call it, because it didn't have any name. Hitherto, the opening had got a pretty bad reputation. There was some old game of Spassky's, a win against O'Kelly de Galway, and like often happens in chess, you know, one influential game by a really strong player tends to put a variation on the sidelines for many years. And, you know, well, we thought, well, why not call it the Fort Knox defence? Because black's position is actually very difficult to break into. The first impression when you look at this position is one of coordination for black. You know, unlike the typical French, black's already got his queen's bishop outside the pawn chain, and it's ready to snap off a white knight as and when necessary. In general, in the Fort Knox, black doesn't have too many difficulties developing his minor pieces. In general, the knight on g8 will come out to f6, and the bishop is usually deployed at e7. Sometimes it goes to d6, but less frequently than the safe square e7. Black's got to be relatively modest in his ambitions when he uses this opening, but what you will get is a solid, tough, resilient position. And as you'll see, some of the world's top players are beginning to appreciate the value of this type of variation in their own games. We're going to look at games exclusively from 2008. The danger to black, and I should stress this quite strongly, is that he won't have any squares for his major pieces in the early middle game. You've got to watch out for that and be aware of it. You get your minor pieces out nice and easily, but it's the major pieces that often cause a problem. Now, the way I intend to approach this section is to show you a bit of theory, and after that we'll look at some typical games from 2008 where black is successful with the Fort Knox defence. Okay, well, white has some choices in this position. Let me just show you first of all a typical move sequence from both colours where both sides put into practice their opening plans. Let's say white castles. Okay, well, black brings his knight out to f6, and white keeps the pieces on with knight to g3. He can, of course, take on f6 in this position, and I think in this case black can take back with the queen. There are certain instances when black can't take back with the queen, but in this case bishop g5 is foiled by bishop takes f3. So that if white plays queen d2, and this is This is a trap which a lot of black players might fall into. Actually, in this position, black can play queen takes d4. But for instance, if there's no black knight on d7, or white is able to give a discovered check with his bishop on d3, then sometimes this trick of winning the black queen might not be noticed. So, but in this particular position, I think black can get away with queen takes d4, and in fact he's winning this position. So going back to the position after queen takes f6, if white hasn't got, for instance, bishop g5 here, he's already under slight pressure because black's threatening to take twice on f3 with a very good endgame, and well, white's got some problems on d4 as well. So that really doesn't cut the mustard, hence knight g3, and now black just continues development with bishop e7. Okay, very, very safe, and white plays queen to e2. This is just a typical sequence. Right, well now we're coming to another interesting position. There's a rule of thumb in the Fort Knox: never take one of the white knights unless white is threatening knight e5. Well, I think with queen e2, white is setting up the positional threat of knight e5. This will be slightly embarrassing for black. If black, say, carelessly castled here, knight e5, knight takes, pawn takes, white has definitely at least a slightly better game in this position. He's got the possibility of rook d1 to hand. He's got the possibility of knight e4 to hand. He's got kingside attacking chances. This is a prospectless position, one which black should avoid. Fortunately, black can cut across all that with bishop takes f3. And, excuse me, just going back one move. Fortunately, black can cut across all that with bishop takes f3. And after queen takes f3, c6, we reach another position very typical of this opening. Black has surrendered the two bishops, but in return he's got coherent play for his pieces. And for instance, let's go one more move further on, castles, and now black is ready for the middle game. He's got a safe king, well entrenched in the centre. Black's queen can come out to either c7, b6, and then a5 according to circumstances. And in general, black is very, very solidly placed here. We're going to see how black develops from this position in the illustrative games. Okay, now we must drop back to the position after knight d7, because obviously white can play slightly more incisively than simply to castle. A very common move for white is queen to e2. Once again, I think black should develop the knight to f6. And now, what about the move bishop to g5? I mean, this looks like a sensible way for white to play. This is what I think a lot of players will do. They'll just not really be aware of any particular move sequence, so they choose a sensible developing continuation. Alright, bishop to e7. And a lot of very aggressive players are going to cast on the queen side in this position. Alright, well then we take on e4. Bishop takes e4. Knight takes e4. Bishop takes e7, and now there's a very interesting continuation for black here, which a lot of white players will overlook. Knight to c3. This highlights the accuracy of black's ninth move when he played bishop takes e4. And already I think white is in some trouble. For instance, if, let's say, white takes on c3, the queen captures on e7. Well, I know I'd much rather be black in this position with the white open king and double pawns. Going back to the position after knight c3, if white tries bishop takes d8, we go knight takes e2 check, king d2, and now knight takes d4. Well, if white wants to avoid the spectre of being material down here, he's got to try bishop takes c7, and then knight takes f3 check, g takes f3. And it's obvious that black has the slightly superior position here, although it's not quite as bad for white as the last variation. White still has double pawns, but he's got a nice bishop, and this should be a counterbalancing feature, although of course it is white for choice. Let's return to the position after bishop e7, because of course white need not castle on the queen side. Let's say white tries to simplify and takes on f6. Alright, well, black takes back with the bishop. In general, with less space, black is happy in this variation to exchange a couple of pairs of minor pieces. Bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, And now, of course, this position is nothing for white. I mean, probably white's most sensible continuation is bishop e4, because, you know, black is ready to castle on either side. His development is at least the equal of white's. White's just got to recognise there's nothing there. And again, black's best continuation is to take go c6, and of course this is completely equal. Going back to the position after bishop e7, perhaps knight g3 would be a more sensible way to approach the position. White's got more space, he keeps the pieces on. Well, after that, I believe the best move for black is knight to d5, and if white exchanges on e7, that's fine for black, with knight f4 and knight b4 in the wings. Black will probably recapture with the queen on e7, and if white retreats with bishop d2, you begin to wonder why white put his bishop on g5 in the first place, and knight b4 is just a good move. Bishop takes b4 probably, bishop takes b4, c3, bishop e7, and of course black has nothing to complain about. So these variations are also satisfactory for black. Going back to the position one more time after queen to e2, knight gf6. The simple castles is a very common continuation for white, and after that, of course, bishop e7 is the prescribed move. And now white plays c4. This is another one of those approaches which is very common at master level. White simply grabs space in the centre. He allows black the possibility of exchanging on e4 if he wishes, and he's just hoping to grind out a very small edge from the opening. Well, of course, the most sensible move is castles here. Obviously, black can take twice on e4 and then play c6. This would lead to another sort of typical position from the opening after b3, and now black can play for counterplay on the queen side with a5. This might be reasonable, but of course castles is also reasonable, and bishop d2 is very, very common. In this type of position, white's going to put the bishop on c3 and try and squeeze out this small edge. Well, I think the most correct continuation for black here is just to hoover off some pieces on e4, to shut the queen out of the game with c6. Let's say white plays bishop c3, knight f6, queen e2. And now black has several reasonable options. He can play his queen out to b6, intending bishop b4. If he wants to keep the pieces on, he may play, for instance, queen to c7, rook d1, and now rook a d8. And black's plan, and you do see this plan again frequently, is rook d7 and rook f d8. So this would also be reasonable, just dropping back to queen e2. Let's see queen b6, because that is also possible. And now black intends to move bishop b4, followed by, for instance, rook a d8, and again that doubling of rooks on the d file. So this also seems pretty reasonable for black. Now let's just drop back one more time to the position after castles, knight gf6. A relatively recent idea, because of course a lot of grandmasters have played this variation with white and they found themselves banging their head against a brick wall, is knight e to d2. This is an idea which has found favour with quite a few strong players, and the idea is to retain pieces and to play knight c4 and then knight e5. If white establishes control over e5 and with any sort of certainty, then he can often build up quite a good kingside attack. So this is reasonably logical. I think the best way to play against this is bishop e7, knight c4, and now bishop d5. This is an interesting move. Bishop d5 not only pressurises the knight on c4, it prepares the typical French freeing break c5. I mean, I think white's plan is positionally impeccable. It's just very slow, and black is getting counterplay with c5 no matter how white plays. For instance, if he carries on with his plan, knight c e5, just simply c5 straight away. And I don't really see any way that white can take advantage of the fact that black's king is still in the centre. Black's going to evacuate fairly quickly, and black will be okay with typical French counterplay. So that is okay. That's a decent way to play against white's newest plan. Now we should go back right to the start, because I want to show you one more line, and it is very critical. back to the position after bishop c6. Well, with all these tries for white running aground, or at least giving him a minute advantage at best, a lot of white players have been looking for more aggressive ways to try and wipe black out. And one of the most dangerous of these is knight eg5. This is one of the lines. There are very few lines in the Fort Knox you have to memorise, but this is one of them. This is what you could call the most dangerous variation. And the point of it is to threaten sacrifices on f7 and e6. For instance, if black carelessly plays the move h6 in this position, this is courting disaster. White goes in with knight takes f7, king takes f7, and now knight e5 check. This is a position to avoid. It's also worth noting that after knight eg5, knight d7, which again is the knee-jerk Fort Knox reaction, once again white can try and put the boot in with knight takes f7. King takes g7, king takes f7, knight g5 check, king e8. Well, I mean, do you really want to go into this position? I think this is definitely a position to avoid. I mean, fortunately, black can avoid all this, and there is a good move in this position, and that is bishop d6. And this is definitely a line which you should remember. Bishop d6 is the way to play, and snuffs out the possibilities of sacrifices. Because if white, of course, goes knight takes f7 in this position, king takes f7, knight g5 check, we go king e8. And I don't think white has enough compensation for the piece here. For instance, if he goes knight takes e6, black can get very, very active straight away with the interesting move queen h4. Going back to the position after after king e8, white can try bishop c4 in this position. Bishop takes g2, knight takes e6. But then comes queen h4, knight takes g7 check, king d7, and again black is surviving. So with bishop d6 looking like a decent move, knight eg5 is, I won't say harmless, but it's possible to defend against it. Going back to the position after bishop c6, bishop d3, knight d7, this is another position where white may play knight eg5. It's the same type of idea. White's trying to crush black off by sacrificing on f7 or e6. Well, once again, I think black is safe here if he goes knight gf6, and if white wants to sack that piece, he can. Knight takes f7, king takes knight g5. It's hard to believe that white is going to have enough compensation here. For instance, after a sequence like this, has white got enough? I very much doubt it. So in general, after knight eg5, knight knight eg5, knight gf6, there's a lot of four letter moves here. White probably castles, and this is a situation where black probably will develop his bishop to d6 because white's wasting a lot of time with the knights, and h6 is just a good move. Again, tempting the sacrifices. There is a little trick here we should be aware of. If rook takes e6 here, just king f8, and white is left with a number of pieces attacked. If white decides to refrain from the temptation and go knight h3, then I think bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, c6 leaves white with a slightly worse variation of the other main lines that we've been looking at, because he's got this terrible knight on h3, and it's going to cost him time to get it back into the game. One interesting fragment of the game, Hopper versus MacDonald, London 2005, goes c3, g5, when black is now cutting the knight out of the game, and he's starting to think about playing outright for the win, with moves such as queen e7 or queen c7 followed by castles on the queen side. For instance, the game went queen e2, queen c7, g3 because h2 was attacked, and then black castles on the queen side with a decent attack. Now, it's time, I think, to summarise the theory. I mean, what you've seen here is basically virtually everything that we know about the Fort Knox in 2000, as it comes to the end of 2008. There are a lot of things, a lot of ways that white can play, but none of them are giving him more than a small advantage, a manageable disadvantage, I think we should say, from black's side, and a lot of them just give him nothing whatsoever. Moreover, this is easy to play. I mean, for instance, you've got to imagine you come home after a day at work, or you're playing in a tournament, you know, you need to conserve energy. You could just play this position quite easily with black, as long as you remember the move sequences after the early knight to g5 by white. You're going to be in good shape. And so we now progress from this theoretical section to some actual games to show how it all works out in practice.